Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we have another special guest. It is the one, the only Scott Hunter. You may know him as one of the three important Scotts at Microsoft. There may be some other Scotts, but we only know of three. So we're very excited to have you here today.
Yeah, Scott, welcome here. We wanted to have you on to kind of chat about a couple of things, including for those of us who are getting long in tooth and gray in hair, we've kind of been aware of your position and everything inside of Microsoft. Today, though, if somebody were stepping up to the .NET development world, they would see Scott Hunter, Director of Program Management. What does that mean, and how did you get there?
Yeah, let's decouple and let's go figure out what a Microsoft title actually means.
I'm a little disappointed that your name doesn't
decouple it fully. I know we don't. I'm not a big title person, so I don't put it in front of my name. But I'm technically partner director of program management at Microsoft, and I'll decouple a couple of those things, like the director part. The director part actually ends up being size of team and size of business that you represent. So in my case, I manage a fairly large team. About 65 people is in my program management group that builds .NET and Java, actually. A lot of folks don't know that, but part of my team builds Java too. And so the director part basically means that I have managers that report to me and that I run a fairly large business. .NET's got 5 million customers. That's a semi-decently large business, I would think, I hope. The partner part of the title ends up being Microsoft kind of has a weird naming convention where you can be a program manager 1, then a program manager 2, then a senior program manager, then a principal program manager, then a partner program manager, and then finally the big one is to be a corporate vice president. And then Scott Guthrie, one of the bigger Scotts at Microsoft, he would be an executive vice president. And of course, I can't even think of the scope of him because he runs like half of Microsoft now. But when I joined Microsoft in 2007, and I primarily was just a person working on some of the features in Asp.NET. So I joined Asp.NET right before we had built MVC and NuGet, and we were still adding features to the .NET framework at that point in time. And if you kind of ask, my journey, I came in and worked on various pieces of ASP.NET. And then one day I woke up and suddenly the entire ASP.NET team reports to me. And then I wake up some other day and the tooling part reports to me. And that's kind of how this happens is, you're running something really well and then they give you kind of more of it. And then you've got the tools to go with it. And then we took an interesting journey at that point. We jumped into the Azure org. So Scott Guthrie moved out of developer division to Azure, and all web stuff came with him. And so I went to Azure with the ASP.NET team and the web tooling team, and we had a chance. It was a great experience because Azure was not very good back then, and we were one of the teams that got to go and try to make it better and give feedback on. Back then, hosting an ASP.NET application in Azure might take you 30 or 40 minutes to get it running the first time, which today you can do in like 30 seconds. It's just, but I was over there for a bit, and that's actually where the beginnings of .NET Core kind of happened. As the ASP.NET team, we had recognized that there was no way for us to build the next generation web platform in .NET Framework. We had tried. The first thing we did is we tried to take ASP.NET and yank it out of .NET Framework, so it would be just a NuGet package that you could install on top of .NET Framework. And we made that work, and it was amazing. And then we tried to make it work with Visual Studio, and and we did that. We realized we were doomed. There was like 8,000 references to System Web in Visual Studio, and we would have to change every one of those to dynamically decide which DLL to load. That we knew that did not look good. But we had built a bunch of crazy tech at that time that IIS, the web server, it could dynamically pick up our DLL, and instead of loading the one from System Web, we had taken that tech as far as we could go, and we realized we were stuck. And that was when what was called Project K at the time was born. And Project K was born out of we had built something called Project Katana. And those bits still ship today. If you're building an MVC5 application on .NET Framework, you'll have some of those DLLs in your project. And Project Katana was about the beginning to start decoupling ASP.NET from IS, the web server. We knew we wanted to run outside of the web server, and so we did that. And then Project K was the web stack that ran technically on top of what we called the Katana bits. And so I have the Project K slide on my computer right now. I don't know if I can I share my screen at all?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Yeah, let's have some fun.
This is great. We're getting a little bit of a history lesson in here too. I remember
and it answered our question that we had weeks
yeah.
ago. What does the K stand for? So we were looking back fondly upon those times and couldn't remember, or maybe you never knew what that K was.
I don't think most people ever really knew what the K was. It was only if you were internal to the team would you know this. Okay, so here's the deck. Let me know if you see it.
Yeah, we do.
we do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we do.
Okay, so the one of the funny things about this deck is look at the date.
Wow.
We didn't ship .NET Core until the summer of 2016, and it
Yep.
really didn't ship until March of 2017, because that was when Visual Studio lit up with .NET Core. So this shows you how far back this went. We had realized in 2013 we were stuck. The first prototype of Project K was built in November of 2013. But these slides are kind of fun. And these are not meant to be disrespectful. This was us just thinking about, looking at the history of .NET Framework. What were some of the challenges? It was monolithic, meaning that everything you could think of was thrown in there. If anybody at Microsoft built something cool, we just shoved it in. We didn't think about whether it should be there or not. We just kept piling junk in.
I used to love getting when the new versions were released, and you'd get the class, do you remember the
Those
posters?
big posters.
Those big
Oh,
posters?
I loved those posters, but I have to imagine it would be that you could plaster the side of a building with one now, right? So
Even back then, you could plaster the side of the building. The reality is that you needed every other year's poster, and you need to put them up on the wall together, because we'd hide the stuff from the previous poster and just put the new stuff in the next poster. I have all those posters, by the way. If anybody wants them, I might have a box of those somewhere.
we're gonna have to, next time we're down in Seattle, we're gonna be hitting you up for those posters now. So
notice it was an OS component. The thing that we learned was that sounded like a great thing at the time. Hey, put it in Windows, everybody will have it. But that means you can't change it, because the breaking compatibility change is the bar for that is so high. You're in a bad place. Heavy servicing burden. Not only were we in the OS, we were in all the OSs. And so that's like Windows 2003, Windows XP, Windows 2008. It was just at one point, and then all the flavors of those things. At one point, we were servicing 12,000 different variants of Windows. That was not a good idea. I already called out the heavy compatibility burden, and there was perf issues, and those perf issues were baked in the framework. There was no way to fix them. When ASP.NET System Web was built, it was meant to be a replacement for active server pages. So it cloned every object in active server pages, which means every request that comes to the server has a server object. It's got all these objects, and whether you use them or not, they're there. And so every request into ASP.NET at that time was 32K. If you look at a .NET Core version of ASP.NET, it ends up being hundreds of bytes, not tens of bytes, I should say. And then obviously we were biased. We were the web team. I was not the .NET person. I was the web person. And so we didn't want any non-server things in our .NET. And then we hated the fact that there was if you've ever used Windows Workflow, there's 2 versions in .NET Framework. They built one, they didn't like it, and so they built another one. And so there's just piles of just stuff that were in there. I'll show one more slide and we can move forward. And I'll ask you the trivia question too. There's a trivia question associated with this. So this was the initial kind of bullets that we thought about. Small core CLR that only contains the basic building blocks. Everything was going to be packages at this time. We didn't want to go bake stuff into the framework. We wanted it to be, way more fluid than that. And we had global assembly caches. We had GAT. We had all those weird things in .NET framework that the GAT could override a package. We wanted to make all that go away and make it very simple. If it's listed, that's what's used. True side by side, so we could break stuff, and not a Windows component. And so when you look at this slide, there's a couple of major missing features or major missing points of .NET Core that are not called out here. And I will challenge James, David, and Simon.
So the first one that jumps out at me right away is the cross-platform piece.
Oh, I was going to say that one.
David got one of them. There's one more. Okay, I'll. The word open source is not listed anywhere on this slide.
Oh God!
Oh wow!
That was oh gosh! That was like I have that queued as. So how did you feel about the open source? I had that all ready to go. Why did I not think of that? Open source, yeah. Go ahead though. Yeah.
Yeah. So we wrote this deck, and this deck probably took me half a year to write. I'm not going to go through all the slides, because we were like, we have to go to Scott Guthrie and ask permission to do this. And to basically go reboot the whole thing. And so we spent a lot of time talking through this and presenting it to various people. We ended up with a meeting with Scott Guthrie and Jason Zander. Jason Zander wrote, at that point, he now runs Azure, but he ran developer division at the time, and Scott was running parts of Azure. And we reported to Scott, so we had both of those people. And so we roll in, and remember, I said we spent half a year on this deck. I get to this slide, and Jason Zander goes, well, this needs to be open source as well, all of it. And he goes, it needs to be cross-platform. And for folks to understand, this era of Microsoft was not the most friendly to this kind of doing non-Windows open source projects. And so I think we were all stunned. And then we got approved on this slide, and we never presented the other slides to Scott or to Jason. So we spent all this time preparing this huge deck, and literally 3 slides in, it should be open source and cross-platform. You're done. Thank you.
I feel like the .NET Foundation should almost have this slide deck as part of the history, just to be in there. So, okay, so like that idea of moving to open source, and I'm going right back to my question, by the way, that idea of doing this in the open source world. I mean, the legacy at that point was 15 years deep almost of ASP.NET. I mean, like what did it feel like the team feel like internally about that move? Because all of a sudden everything you're doing is just going to be out there, right?
Yeah. The open source move was very interesting from a variety of standpoints. I'll tell you some anecdotes from that era that are just funny. The first thing is, at this point, nobody really sees the source code for ASP.NET. So as soon as we announced we're going open source, we had some developers that left the team.
Really?
And
Wow.
because their fear was their source code was going to be available to the public to see, and so if they made mistakes or their code wasn't the most efficient or whatnot, there was this fear of the first thing that happened was some of the internal folks came to us and said, I want to use a different name on GitHub. And we're like, what? I don't want to put Microsoft next to my name on GitHub. There was just it was just a cycle of not being comfortable and familiar with that kind of development. Was just new. Marketing both liked the fact that we were open source, and they also hated the fact that we were open source because it meant there was no way to hide. Up to this point, we would disappear for 3 years, go build some new features, and we were terrible at this as well because they were all built in secret, which meant who knows if they were going to be the right things, because they were literally built in secret. And we show up one day and we raise the curtain and here's these features, and we hope they're good. But marketing loved the fact that there was those announced, those reveals, and we don't have those reveals anymore. And so there was the sentiment, against, hey, we don't have these big reveals anymore. Some of the other things that kind of came to play was many parts of the company were fear. there was a fear there was going to be a cost burden for being open source, which sounds crazy. It's going to be more expensive to do it open source. No, actually, it should be less expensive to do it open source, because in some cases, people will find things before our own testers find stuff, or we find stuff. And we learned as well on this journey as well is when I first joined Asp.Net in 2007, I came in. I'd been building Asp.Net apps probably at that point for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And I knew all the parts of the product that I thought were broken. And you come into Microsoft, I'm going to fix all the stuff that's broken. And then you realize, no, I'm not going to fix those things, because, I always used to wish we did a few of these. We actually did a couple of triages live back in that era. And the reality was that, what you find out very quickly is we have lots of bugs. And we're going to fix the bugs that impact most customers, which means some of the small bugs that I'd like to go fix never make it into being fixed, because they just don't impact enough people. Yeah, I'm passionate about it, but I can't even go tell my engineering director we should do that one over the one that affects 1 million customers. So there was a whole bunch of those, kinds of things that kind of rippled through the system during that era. Another one that we also lost engineers over was we went from a model of having this legacy testing team that wrote, screen tests and all this kind of crazy stuff, and we were always way behind on tests. And we also decided as part of this that we were going to do everything had to be unit tested. And there was developers that never written unit tests, and when we came to them and said you have to write unit tests checking code, they're like, nope. And they would go find a team inside of Microsoft that did not require that still. Today, I think you wouldn't find a job at all. But those are just paradigm shifts that were kind of happening, and we were in the middle of all that stuff. And of course, Microsoft wasn't super friendly at that point in time in open source world either. So we had to be kind of quiet too. I remember Scott Guthrie telling us, just I love all the stuff you're doing, just don't cause a big media thing.
And now Microsoft is if I'm not mistaken, the largest contributor to open source on the planet, right? Like there's almost everybody who works in development is involved in open source in some way.
I think so. There was a couple of years ago when we made that statement a couple of years ago, and it was a little off because it was like they were comparing us to Google at the time, but they were ignoring projects like Angular and Android and stuff like that. So Google's got a lot of code too. So a lot of folks have a lot of code, but we have I would think among all of the big companies today, we're all doing a ton of open source. And another big thing that folks don't realize was through that era, right into 2012 was the tipping point for us in open source. It was before this project really started. That was when we open sourced all of ASP.NET. That was Web API, MVC, SignalR. 2012 also turned the corner when we could actually, that's when we started permitting changes from the public into the product. I had to do, myself and some of the other members of my team, we spent a year, probably 2011, halfway through 2011, halfway through 2012, just sitting with lawyers doing patent reviews to think about, hey, if we do this, what in the patent portfolio are we going to give up as part of this? And are there things that we want to protect? And a lot of that was interesting because Scott Guthrie has patents way back to like 2007, 1997, 98, around web tech. And, I remember sitting with the lawyers and I'm like, I'm glad we have these patents, but we'll never, ever, go after anybody for one of these patents. Those patents were strong enough. We could have taken every other web tech down if we wanted to. But imagine the backlash that would have happened. And that's how we fought a lot of that stuff with legal. It's like, yeah, these are amazing patents. But we would be the worst company on the planet if we ever tried to use one of these things. I mean, it would just be a terrible thing. And so we put a bunch of those things into a bucket like that and kind of pushed them off to the side. But today, doing the same thing, if I want to go build an open source project and put it on GitHub, the approval process takes about 10 seconds compared to a year.
That is really great.
I certainly think of Microsoft as kind of one of the friendlier companies in the open source space. I mean, just the relationships that Microsoft has with the open source community feel really good and well cultivated. And like, I think about a very large bookseller who should remain nameless, that I mean also have a lot of products that have a history in open source, but their relationships with open source seem to be just terrible universally, and Microsoft have taken a much better approach on that.
I am very happy. You are right. That's a great point. I know exactly what you're talking about, and we try really hard not to trip into that. We embrace versus take over or extinguish or any of those types of things, and in some ways, I think Microsoft we have to be different because we come from there was the era of Microsoft that the antitrust lawsuits in the United States. There was a variety of things that we were not the greatest friend or ally for other companies and other developers in the world at that point in time. And so in many cases, I think we're trying to make up for that and erase our past a little bit. But I've been super happy with what we've done. And even back in 2012 when we were doing the Asp.Net thing, we had plenty of other teams that would come to us and say, hey, we want to open source something. And what they really meant was we're going to take an old product that we don't care about anymore. We're going to throw the source code over the fence into the public. And we used to tell them, no, you can't do that. We don't open things unless we're going to contribute to them in the future.
Or their live writer.
Live writer, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. But it's crazy when we were doing that 2012 Asp.NET and EF Entity Framework open source thing. I remember having to go to Soma. Remember, I was in the cloud, and Soma ran developer division, and I basically had to promise him that I was going to keep contributing to those projects. That I wasn't just going to make them open source and kill them. We'd never had any intention to do that. But it's just interesting to think of the questions and things we were asked back in that time.
I remember I was like when the first rumblings of open source at Microsoft were starting to kind of come about. I was like, what are they going to do if they open source everything? Make money. Obviously, Azure was the play, but I remember at Mix 11 with Open Source Fest, which is coincidentally where I met Nick Molnar. But I think that was the first one that was held. That Microsoft actually put together and said, let's bring together a community of open source developers, and the response was overwhelming, and it seemed like it was ready. So I do feel like the timing was right for the market, and the some of the negativity that was out there surrounding the concepts of open source was perhaps for naught. We didn't need to have it, and it's certainly a long. And I didn't raise the point of Microsoft being the largest contributor as a point of competition, but just to go back from that 2011 to be hesitant to be involved in the open source community to today being like a prominent player.
Yeah, now that you say that, I forgot some of the other fun points in that era too. Was one of the things that caused us to do .NET Core the way .NET Core was. It was Scott Hanselman and I were traveling Europe on a road trip one time. We were doing, and by the way, I don't recommend doing any of these road trips with Hanselman because we didn't do like one event every couple days. We did 3 events a day for 2 weeks.
Wow.
It was grueling. By the time we were done, we were robots, meaning that we were so good together on the stage because we had done so many that it was easy, but we were tired. But anyways, we're traveling through Europe, and it was the beginning of some of the companies coming to us and saying, "Well, we can't use .NET," and we're like, "Why can't you use .NET?" They said, "The rules in our company are we only buy proprietary operating systems and Office tools, and everything else in our company has to be open source." And so there was that wave that was kind of starting where nobody wanted to use a technology that maybe we would quit working on, and that company is stuck. They want to know that the code's there and they could do something with it. And so there was that pressure that was coming against us. Then there was the opposite pressure. I remember when we went open source, we had companies come to us and saying, "Oh, we're afraid to use your product now." And I'm like, "Why?" And it's like, "It's open source." And I said, "Well, no, the source code is open. the binaries that I ship you are still signed by Microsoft. They're built by our engineers, and they come with the same warranties and the same support as we always have. And we for a couple of years, we had to be very clear in our presentations that, yeah, the tech is open, but it's built by us, and the binaries that we actually give you, have been run through our QA process, and they're signed by us, and they have the same support. So there was, I don't hear any of that anymore. That has completely disappeared in the last 5 years.
Okay, so we took some notes ahead of time here, and I believe it was Simon that had written in there, just out of curiosity, in terms of scope, .NET has really widened the footprint of the reach for the development tools. Is there an area that has surprised you where it was adopted or didn't get adopted as much as you had anticipated?
I think, first off, I think adoption all up, we're amazingly happy with the adoption that we've had. If you look at where we stand today, we have over 5 million .NET developers. We're growing at 1 million a year. If you told me in 2015 that was possible, I would have, I would have questioned that. If there's an area that I want us to do better in, I think the area is, and you all will be very familiar with this area. It is, I think native UI is still an area that we all struggle with. Web, we feel really good. We have great solutions for IoT. We have good solutions for machine learning. But if you want to go build a desktop application, that space still feels, well, we have WinForms and WPF. That's some older tech. The Windows team released UWP, which didn't do great. It brought a bunch of constraints on. There's now WinUI, and we have Xamarin. And so for me, if there's a part of my product that confuses me, it's like, if you're a developer picking up my tech, that is a confusing story. So that's probably an area that if we really want to work on is shoring that up. I do think we're going to go, a different place than a lot of folks might think there. Like, for example, I think an interesting, the way I think of this space today is, a lot of us are running Electron apps. In fact, we're sitting inside of Electron app today. I'm talking to you in Skype, which is an Electron app. Plenty of our customers have built Blazor applications, and they run them inside of Electron.net, which lets you, electronify a .NET project. And so I think one of the big things you'll start seeing us in .NET 6 do is give our developers a great hybrid UI story. And I think what we're going to try to do is there's a project out there called Blazor Mobile Bindings. And that is a project that lets you put a Blazor web view inside of a Xamarin app. And what that does is gives you the ability to build a chunk of your UI in web, so it looks the same or looks pretty good across a variety of operating systems: iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows. But it still lets you have the native shell, which means the problem with a Blazor app is it's a web app. It cannot escape the sandbox of the browser. I was just dealing with a customer just a couple weeks ago, and they rebuilt their entire infrastructure on Blazor. Now they moved from VB6, so that'll date them a little bit. But
That's a big jump.
I'm doing one of those now, by the way.
But they end up having to write a WPF application, which they hosted a web view, and then put the Blazor app inside of that for the retail store. For the customers, they would just use the Blazor app as it is. But the retail store, the app has to have access to the cash register. It has to have access to the machinery that makes, this is a dry cleaners, the machinery that makes the clothes spin around on the rack. And it had to drive some displays. And so the app needed access to local hardware or local stuff that you can't get out of the sandbox of the browser. And so they had to wrap that app in a WPF app to make that work. And I want to make, one of our goals in .NET 6 will be to make that a common scenario for a developer. If you want to go build I think the way it'll be is you'll build a Xamarin app, and we'll have a Blazor WebView tag that you can put inside the XAML of your Xamarin app. And then you basically welded the two things together. And that'll be the beginning of this journey. We would love to, to me, that's the cross-platform UI story that I think that we really will end up with, is like, we give you the ability to put some native controls in via Xamarin. Those native controls work across all the OSs. In the case of that running on top of Windows, we would hope that our Xamarin tech for Windows would be using WinUI, the latest technology that Windows has. And so we give you the best of all the worlds. If you want to build native Windows UI, you can do that. If you want to share web UI across all the platforms, you can do that. If you want native access to the network or the hardware, you can do that. And so I think that's going to be a big space. And to me, what I just described is what I would really call, we called this .NET MAUI a year or so ago. And I think we've moved the MAUI vision to be more of what I just described to you than kind of what it was a year ago.
Cool. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting approach, because it's really difficult to build good-looking applications across different platforms and different windowing toolkits and all of that. And it seems like we already kind of have the only success story in that space is kind of the web, and being able to leverage that is fantastic, because there's 20 plus years of people making that look good and work well and be performant. And we've come to this amazing place now where I can write my web applications in anything and run them on people's browsers. I don't have to write JavaScript anymore, even though I unfortunately do. Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting time. I think you've hit the nail on the head on where this is going to go.
Yeah, the customer I was talking about, their bragging point was they only had to write 20 lines of JavaScript for this huge app, and it's a beautiful app. And they're like, and we only had to write 20 lines of JavaScript. And of course, the Blazor team jumps in. They're like, we want to see what JavaScript you wrote, so we can go see if we can solve that too.
Get that out of there.
So, I mean, you've come to this point now where you show us the slide deck from 2013. It seems like you've accomplished all of these things. Do you ever worry that you're going to end up in this position where you've conquered all the worlds and there's nothing else to do?
That is not something I ever worry about. It's one of the things that's crazy about my career is I've been at Microsoft for 13 and a half years at this point. And I worked in .NET all of those 13 and a half years, which seems like a long time to stay in a particular technology. But I think the reason I'm still in Microsoft in this technology is because there's always new challenges. I mean, WebAssembly is something that just kind of came up in the last couple of years. WebAssembly could go even a step further, where maybe that's how we run containerized apps in the future. It could be a sandbox that you run all apps in. Apple just released some amazing tech a couple weeks ago with their announcement of the M1 chips. And that's basically showing ARM tech that is faster than Intel and AMD tech. That is, another place for .NET is, to make sure that we embrace, ARM. One of the things we did in .NET 5 was we actually support ARM64 for Windows. So if you have a Surface X laptop, you can build native ARM apps with .NET 5 for that. And sometime next year, we already got WinForms ported to ARM64, and the Windows team's in the process of porting WPF to ARM64. But I think because these things just keep coming up, there's always new avenues and new directions for tech to go in. I mean, containers, Kubernetes, ARM chips, WebAssembly. Can we make it smaller, faster, native? Can we do ahead of time compile? There's so many challenges. I always ask myself kind of what you're asking me, which is, when is it .NET 6? Is it .NET 7? When have we exhausted all the things that we need to do? For the most part, .NET Core 1 through 3 were kind of catch-ups. Even maybe .NET 5 a little bit of a catch-up to where we've fallen behind in places in the industry. I challenged the team. I said, at some point, we're going to be really caught up, and it's going to be more about doing more innovative stuff. And so and so I think some of the stuff I also want to do as we look forward is more stuff that crosses like the runtime and the compiler. You know, historically, Microsoft was all broken up into components, and the two teams didn't talk to each other. And now you see things like span that we put into .NET, which makes .NET a lot faster, and that's collaborations from the frameworks to the runtimes. And there's a whole bunch of those that we have in the that we're thinking about. And so there's tons of exciting stuff still to do. I pinch myself every year to be able to work on this tech and push it forward.
It's amazing to me that you only have 65 people behind this. Like, it seems like there should be hundreds of people behind this. Like, the one that surprised me was I saw a picture of the Azure Functions team, and I know maybe like 5 people on that team, but the team itself is like 100 people. And here you are building this entire technology stack with 65.
Well, let me be clear. I have 65 program managers that work for me. There's also an engineering org. So I have an engineering Cunningham. He's my peer on the engineering side, and that's a couple hundred people.
Oh, okay.
So so .NET all up ends up being a couple hundred people. My team is, there's developers that write code, and then the program managers are the ones that are looking at the market, looking at the new tech that's coming out, trying to figure out the roadmap and the direction that we should go move our product in. We work with the engineering team to make sure that we're implementing the right features and the right technologies on the stack. You folks are all familiar with Scott Hanselman. He runs my community team, and they're responsible for the .NET website, a bunch of our training videos, me speaking to people like you. So there's lots of moving parts. But I will tell you, I remember in 2007, when I joined Microsoft, I had told my recruiter, I said, I interviewed at Microsoft twice. I failed the first interview. And the first interview, I thought I was interviewing with this, but they had looked at my past and they found that I'd worked at a company called Starbase. And Starbase built some tools very similar to TFS, Team Foundation Server. And so I show up for my interview and they start asking me all these source control questions. And I'm like, what is going on? And they had hijacked me out of the C# team into the TFS team. And that did not go well because I was not expecting that. And so the second interview, I told them, I want to interview for the .NET team. If I'm not going to go talk to the .NET team, please do not fly me up. I don't want to go do another one of these weird things. So I go through that process and I show up, and I still think, to me, ASP.NET was still the biggest part of .NET, even though WinForms and WinForms and WPF were big. I really thought of .NET as a web thing, and so I'm thinking the ASP.NET team is going to be some huge team. At that time, the PM team on ASP.NET was 3 people. I was one of them, and the engineering team was about 10 people. And so ASP.NET all up, I'm this huge $1 billion company, and there's 13 people responsible for like ASP.NET. I'm like, wow, I was stunned. I was thinking it was gonna be like the whole floor of the building or a whole building, and it ended up being a very small team.
I gotta say, my wife and we own a bakery, and we have 20 people. We don't quite do $1 billion in sales, but but we've got a bigger team than you had, so I'm clearly winning, right?
I was going to say, the funny thing though was
basically just David Fowler and 64 product managers to keep him in line.
In 2007, there was no David Fowler. So David Fowler came on around 2008, and I was his first. So he and I paired up super early back in the day, and there was another person who doesn't get enough credit, David Ebo. David Ebo is responsible for so much of ASP.NET and so much of app service too. So when you think of functions and this stuff, David Ebo's footprints or fingerprints are all over that stuff. And I was blessed to get paired up with David Ebo and David Fowler and myself, and we were kind of a unit that built some tech in ASP.NET for many years as we went through the company. But I was going to laugh and say, while the team was small, the team being small was why we were so innovative. Um, we didn't have a lot of bureaucracy. We didn't have a lot of stuff. It was literally, we would just come up with ideas and implement them. MVC was built with like 3 people. NuGet was built with like 2 or 3 people. So it was, you know, it's both good and bad. Sometimes being small means you can move faster. The bigger you get, the slower you can move in some cases. I've been very happy, even though the overall .NET team is really big, or depending how you determine it. The fact that we can ship every year a new release, because the same size .NET team back in 2007 shipped every 3 or 4 years, on that huge monolithic project. So, we sped the whole thing up, and hopefully we keep the speed moving.
One of the things I try to wrap my head around, kind of related to these team sizes and how fast you're able to move. One of those earlier slides that you shared about the original .NET framework was that maintenance and support burden and like all the versions of Windows that you had to support and everything. Isn't that even worse now with Core? Like, I mean, you're on so many operating systems and like it's a bigger footprint. So how do you manage that now? And is it bigger or smaller than it used to be?
It's actually smaller.
Okay.
And the big thing, which, some customers still don't understand, we have what we call an LTS release, and we have what we call a current release. And even though that's widespread through the industry, it's new to .NET developers. So if you're a Node developer, a Java developer, you're used to those terms, you know what they mean. We're still trying to educate our customers. But we put that system together, where every other release is an LTS, and our support lifecycle is 3 years. That is all designed on purpose. So there's only ever 2 long-term releases in support at one time. So right now, there is .NET Core 2.1 and there is .NET Core 3.1 that are both the LTS releases, which means, yes, maybe there's 10 operating systems or 15 operating systems on each of those. So that's 30. If you took .NET Framework and looked at all the various flavors of Windows Server, the permutations were in the thousands or the hundreds.
Oh, wow.
And so what we've done is basically put a limit on our support, on purpose, to make sure we don't, some of my customers go, make every release an LTS release. Okay, well then I've got 5 at a time that I have to maintain. And I'll throw a random number out. It costs us about $1.8 million to maintain an LTS. So 2 of them is, and that's basically accounting for the salaries of the people required to make one of those things stay supported. And so the question is, how much of my team do I want to invest in doing that, or do we want to be a team that's moving faster? So we're trying to educate our customers, and the education I would tell you is there's a false promise on those even on like a long-term support. A company will come to, I'm going to use the LTS, I'm going to build my product in January, and it's done. Well, we patch the LTS release every month, and some of those are security patches. So unless you're actually building the app every month, it's not a secure app.
Right.
Just because you chose an LTS release doesn't mean you have some magic. We were talking to a healthcare thing just recently, and they're using .NET in MRI machines, and they're like, we want 10 years of support. And I'm like, well, how often do you update the MRI machine? Every 10 years. Well, what are you paying for? If you're not going to patch it, and they don't update the machines because the machines are air gapped by design. So you don't want somebody to hack an MRI machine and obviously kill somebody. They're meant to be air gapped, and if they're air gapped, you probably don't need my patches anyways because you're running in a very secure environment. But there's so much confusion around support and how it works, and modern software, you should be building your software every month. You should be using a CI/CD pipeline, and whether your developers are working on it or not, it should still be spitting out builds, and your developers should be at least maintaining that pipeline to make sure it still builds correctly. What we find is our older customers literally built projects, ripped all the developers off of them, and then they keep using that thing for like 10 years, and that is not secure. And even .NET Framework with us patching the operating system, it's still not secure. You need to keep your apps current.
I'm going to keep a killer MRI machine in my back pocket for next time I write a science fiction novel, though.
Scott, you touched earlier on how the marketing department, they didn't like the idea that they didn't have these big reveals at certain points, and it kind of ties into a question that I'd love to hear your insight on. And I usually get made fun of a little bit here by Simon, but if you get to peer, into the Microsoft future, what is or maybe even just the industry at large, what's the thing that you're most excited about? What is it going to be that you're just, when that arrives, you're going to be like this is what we should have been doing for some time now, or how do you see the future unfolding?
I think I've already answered this, James. I think the hybrid desktop apps is what I'm excited about the most right now.
Right.
That is, if you ask me this question next year, I might have a different answer. But WebAssembly and hybrid web apps are the two things that are most interesting to me at this point in time. I mean, WebAssembly, in the form of Blazor, is interesting, but I think WebAssembly could go beyond being just a Blazor thing. It could be something, as I mentioned before, containers. Today, think about how we build software. We compile software to ARM or we compile it to AMD, Intel instructions, whatever. What if we just compiled to WebAssembly and it ran everywhere? What if an app truly was a compile once and you're done and it runs on all the platforms? What if WebAssembly provides that, container style kind of sandbox, so you can actually run a bunch of apps on the same machine side by side without risk of them leaking into each other? And so I think, if you Google WebAssembly server, you'll probably find some various projects of people trying to explore this area. So I think WebAssembly is something that could go way beyond where we're at. I think the hybrid web stuff is super interesting. And then we don't know the answer to it, but even things like Project Pi, which is, we're trying to find a way to make it where if you build these apps and want to host them up in crazy orchestrated container environments that exist today, how do we make that easy? Because really our job in .NET is to make you more productive and make your job easier. And we don't know all the wrinkles in that thing. That is something that we just know that, hand building containers and publishing them to Kubernetes is hard. If I could make that, I don't want to say right click publish, but if I could make it that easy, that's super interesting to me. And so those three areas are probably the top of mind to me today. But I could go on in many ways. Like Blazor server is super cool. We don't provide the right backend on that yet. Like if your Blazor server connection if you get disconnected for any reason, you got to refresh the browser and kind of start over. So we want to explore if we can build the right state management on the back end of .NET. I'm going to use a term I hate, an actor framework. And so every Blazor server user ends up being an actor in some kind of distributed cache system, which means you can cut the connection down but I can randomly riff on this stuff all day, folks, because that's what makes this area so interesting, and that's why I love tech. Is there's always a new problem, a new challenge, a new platform. I assume that's why you guys like tech.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I mostly like it because it's so attractive being in tech to the opposite sex.
I don't even know how to answer that. That's
There's no way to answer
It's not
that.
a statement you hear very frequently. All right. Well, this has been amazing. We really appreciate you coming on. We've had such good conversations and some great insights from you. So we're going to call you back in 10 years and see how wrong you were about all your predictions. So we'll hold you to that, and Blazor on WebAssembly is going to be the new nobody needs more than 640K. But everybody out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of the ASP.NET Monsters. Remember to like, comment, and share, and we'll see everybody next episode. Bye.
Cheers.